Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Juliet Hooker.
And I'm Bonnie Honig.
And we are two of the founding directors of the Democracy Project at Brown.
The Democracy Project aims to ignite and amplify conversations at Brown about the necessary conditions of democratic politics. We center the institutional and cultural politics of democratic equality, specifically the politics of race and gender, in the US and around the world. We hope to contribute further to discussions on campus that are already ongoing and focused on climate, catastrophe, media, objectivity, and truth.
We could think of no better way to start the large public part of our work than with today's speaker, who has written powerfully and insightfully about the challenges facing US democracy today. Melvin Rogers, the third founding director of the Democracy Project, who is also the associate director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, where the Democracy Project is housed, will introduce tonight's speaker more fully. Before we turn to that, however, we want to recognize Melvin's work taking the lead on organizing Professor Glaude's visit, which also included an afternoon of meetings with students and faculty at Brown. Thank you, Melvin.
We also want to thank the PPE Center, David Scarbeck, Ali Laughlin, and the whole PPE team for their support, both for this event and for the Democracy Project.
And we now welcome Melvin Rogers to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker.
So it is so great to see all of you here. Thank you for coming out for this Democracy Project PPE event. So before I introduce Eddie, let me say, because they were given all the thanks, let me thank Bonnie and Juliet as the co-directors of the Democracy Project for their leadership as we are trying to imagine together what the Democracy Project will be here at Brown, and we're hoping that all of you will imagine with us together. So I am honored and delighted to introduce Eddie Glaude. I have known Eddie for many years, at first as an undergraduate student of his, and as someone from whom I have received intellectual guidance on my work and scholarship, and throughout as a friend. And throughout those many years, Eddie has modeled for me thoughtfulness, intellectual rigor, and a need to be a critical steward of the complicated religious and political traditions of the United States. It was first with him that I was introduced to the richness of African-American political thought and its many insights for what it means to struggle amid domination while retaining one's dignity, and what it means to imagine beyond constraints. Eddie is the James S. McDowell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. But his place in American intellectual and cultural life, I think, extends far beyond the walls of academia into your living rooms or wherever you find yourself watching MSNBC. He has worked carefully and diligently to reimagine his writing style in works such as Democracy in Black or Begin Again to reach a wider audience without compromising complicated and nuanced arguments and figures. In those works, he strongly insists that we confront the mess or ruins of American life, his language, and how white supremacy continues to capture and structure America's political, economic, and moral culture. His work is always on the edge of despair as he joins James Baldwin in thinking that we in the United States have become moral and political disasters. But just as you think his writing will be overtaken by despair, he again joins Baldwin in thinking that we cannot be complacent about the disasters we have become and the injustices that follow in their wake. There's equal value and strength, he argues, at the end of Begin Again in our imagination. Americans must, Glaude writes, quote, walk through the ruins toward the terror and fear, and lay bare the trauma that we all carry within us, end quote. In doing so, we may yet give our political imaginations both life and direction. In his earlier works, such as Exodus or In a Shade of Blue, or the recent works, you can't help but see a thinker grappling with the ethical life, the identity of the country and the communities to which he belongs. As he confronts, and we with him, the persistence of white supremacy and the practices of racial disregard, we find ourselves coming back, or at least I do, to important questions. Who do we take ourselves to be in the lives we live and the practices in which we participate? Why are we not diminished in our own eyes by the racial inequities and horrors we continue to see in this country? Eddie, we are so delighted to have you here and to journey with you as you engage those questions, as we move together on that journey with you through the ruins. Thank you.
Thank you, Melvin, for that wonderful introduction. I love you dearly. We have to express that in public. Yes. It's a delight to be here with you this evening, to see old friends. Wow. Naliwe Rooks is out there. I haven't seen Naliwe in a while. We caused a lot of trouble while we were together at Princeton. She helped build that extraordinary program there. I don't want to start naming names. That's how preachers get in trouble. But it's a delight to be here with you this evening. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Juliet, for doing what you do. I want to thank PPE. I want to thank Allie for all that you're doing. I want to thank the invisible labor that helped make this happen. Lucas, who is doing what he's doing back there, I appreciate you. We always got to lift up the invisible labor that makes our lives possible. But it is a delight to be here with you, to see old friends again, and to return to the place that helped shape my son into the man he is becoming. Langston speaks so fondly of his time at Brown. He found his voice here, and I suppose he stumbled into true love. And for that I am eternally grateful. It is also one of those moments where the bewildering nature of time itself comes into view. I'm feeling a bit old these days, especially this evening. Time presses in on you in unexpected ways. Former students become towering figures in their own right, and you're left to marvel at their accomplishments and brilliance. It is a delight, really, an indication that the tradition carries on. But sometimes, especially when the Irish whiskey carries a bit more weight than it should, and regret intrudes, I long for that most American of attributes, the inability to believe that time is real, as James Baldwin put it, where we remain forever young and innocent, and I suppose because of it all, monstrous. Sober thoughts are much better suited for such an occasion as this. I found myself the other day, and it is somewhat surprising to admit as much, I found myself rereading Ralph Ellison. It is a surprising admission insofar as I have already confessed and begin again that Ellison, for me, served as a means to evade any serious grappling with my wounds. His mask fit perfectly, I wrote. I enjoyed his cool pose and the sophistication of his ideas. He kept you at a distance while beneath the surface storms raged. Safety, however unsettling, could be found behind his mask. Safety from what, I must admit, is a different question for a different occasion. But the attraction remains, even now. I know, although I did not write this on the page then, that Ellison means more to me than a simple evasion of childhood wounds. After all, my son's middle name derives from my love of the old man. Wounded attachments are nevertheless attachments. And I mean by that something more than Wendy Brown's use of the phrase. It is the fact that Arnold Rampersad's biography of Ellison broke my heart. I didn't like the man anymore after reading him. And I've come to see now, as I've returned to his work at this stage in my life, that the old man has left his mark on me. Ellison comes into view now as I struggle to understand the current moment in the United States with its contradictions and deadly betrayals, where race continues to confound this democratic experiment. That contradiction has, since the beginning, threatened to swallow whole the entire experiment in a form of madness that seizes the moral compass. Ellison haunts me, as so many do these days, as I reach for languages to offer a way to the other side of this mess. To use a word from Beckett, language is a way, finally, to get out of history's ass pocket in this God-soaked country. Not to escape history, mind you, but to orient ourselves more appropriately to its demands. Mine is not Joyce's anxiety. History can be a nightmare, but it cannot be left behind. So I'm not so much interested in Ellison's politics. That's not quite right. I just don't argue with him in a certain way or agree with him in a certain way. His patriotism, particularly of his later days, scrapes the nerves. Nor am I interested, at least on this occasion, in unpacking his view of art and the role of the artist, which borders at times on a kind of aestheticism that I find, especially in moments of political strife, and particularly from the pen of one of those darker souls, a sin against the Holy Ghost. Instead, I'm interested in the role and place of history and how we think about race and democracy, about the madness that results from our evasions. We are, after all, a nation full of Nortons in Golden Day. And about what is required of us if we are to imagine ourselves otherwise. Ellison, I believe, can be helpful in this regard. As I reached for him in preparation for this lecture at the alma mater of my only child whose middle name derives from him, I came across an essay he delivered here in Sells Hall at a conference in his honor entitled Going to the Territory. Going to the Territory was the keynote address at a gathering that Michael Harper, you remember the beloved Michael Harper here, don't you? Michael Harper, I guess you don't. Michael Harper and his colleague Barry Beckham, they organized a conference in Ellison's honor in September of 1979. And in a moment in his life when retirement from NYU was just weeks away, and as he took stock of the time that was left for him as a writer, Ellison was delighted by the seriousness with which scholars and students here at Brown engaged his work. Remember, in 1979, Ellison is caught between the disaster of the fire in 1967, which destroyed the manuscript of his second novel, his perfectionism, which seized his pen, and the changing environment of Black writers, women writers who were emerging. Ellison seemed out of step and a bit off balance. But Ellison was delighted. He was excited by the unveiling of the watercolor portrait of Emmon Page, the first Black graduate of Brown University, class of 1877, in Rockefeller Library. The man, as principal of Douglas High School in Oklahoma City, along with his daughter, Zelia Bro, Ellison's music teacher, who gave Ellison a sense of the world and of himself. Now, I don't want to go into detail about his tribute to Dr. Page and Mrs. Bro. It is at once beautiful and moving. I will suspend for this occasion his account of the power of the vernacular in the ongoing shaping of democratic life in this country, although a certain kind of story constitutes the stage upon which the vernacular makes itself known and felt. Instead, it is Ellison's framing reflections on history that grabbed my attention, and it is here that I want to direct yours. Americans continue to stumble over and into the details of the past that made them who they are. Ellison offers several reasons for this. One has to do with the nature of the country's founding and the pace of its development. As he put it, quote, given the circumstances of our national origins, our vast geopolitical space, and the improvised character of our society, and given the mind-boggling rapidity of our national growth, perhaps it's understandably difficult for Americans to keep in touch with what has happened to them, end quote. No matter. Over the course of the history of the country, a lot has been overlooked or forgotten. And the result of it all, no matter the reasons, has been what Ellison describes as two basic versions of American history. Two basic versions of American history. One which is written and as neatly stylized as ancient myth, he writes, and the other unwritten and as chaotic and full of contradictions, changes of pace and surprises as life itself, end quote. Americans, he noted, can be, quote, notoriously selective in the exercise of historical memory. This self-deceptive magic, he describes it. He calls it tricky magic in his 1970 essay, What Would America Be Without Blacks, consists in something more than forgetfulness. It is an alchemy which transforms fears and hatreds into scapegoats and eases the pain and panic of a nation uncertain about who and what it is. Ellison writes, quote, our unwritten history looms as recorded history's obscure alter ego. This is what he said in Sells Hall. And although repressed from our general knowledge of ourselves, it is always active in the shaping of events. It is always with us, questioning, even when not accusing its acclaimed double, and with the two locked in mute argument, which is likely to shock us when it becomes visible during periods of national stress. Meanwhile, he says, yearning and thirsting for a rational order and being forced as human beings to live in what we like to identify as the present, we go on struggling against the built-in conditions which comprise the pathology of American democracy, end quote. Willfully blind to the facts of our experience that would, if attended to, unmask the contradiction between the, quote, details of the history we choose to remember and those which we ignore or leave unstated, end quote. We find ourselves, Ellison says, in a constant state of debate and contention. Here we see in broad outline the features of what might be called Ellison's agonistic view of democracy, a particular way of rendering his idea of antagonistic cooperation. He says, there's a quote here, no matter how we choose to view ourselves in the abstract, in the world of work and politics, Americans live in a constant state of debate and contention. We do so no matter what kinds of narratives, oral or written, are made in construction of our common experience. American democracy is a most dramatic form of social organization, and in that drama, each of us enacts his role by asserting his own and his group's values and traditions against those of his fellow citizens. Indeed, a battle royal conflict of interest appears to be basic to our conceptions of freedom. I don't think he read his Carl Schmitt or Chantal Mouffe or even you, Bonnie. But we see him in the zone, right, in that space. That aside, Ellison reveals what is lost in our national insistence to bury the details of our experience, the fact that on the lower frequencies we may speak for you, right? That we lose sight of who and where we are, where and who we are. Outside the margins of written history, the neat and tidy legends, lies the messiness of American life where democracy lives, he says, in spite of the mighty efforts to slay the fire drake. Democracy lives in the cultural doings and sufferings of everyday people. Ellison calls this, quote, the unconscious logic of the democratic process. And he spends much of his time desperately trying to get us to see that despite all of the noise above ground, that underneath, democratic life is vibrant, subverting categories that constrain, transforming old forms into new ones, making life swing, Duke Ellington style. But we cannot forget the dangers that come with the written story. The dangers that come with the written story, the violence that defends its plots and characters at all costs. I get what the old man is doing, but his belief in the spirit of the founding, moving like Hegel's Geist across Americans' generations, allows him to have the faith that despite the, quote, unceasing pressure on our American principles and beliefs by our equally American blindness and greed, end quote, the American project stands, and we must honor that. That's what he said here. This is the patriotism that grates the nerves, with the safety net that our unwritten history is always at work in the background. Here, the debate and contention, so critical to American life and politics, at least as I'm reading him in this moment, seems a bit genteel, when it comes to these two different versions of our history. It seems to me that the battle over the written story is not resolved by pointing to the work of the unwritten one. Much more is required of us, especially if we are to do more than stumble about with the wobbly legs of a toddler. Who we take ourselves to be, our commitments to the values that evidence our view of the good and the just are often bound up with the stories we tell about our doings and sufferings. We have to fight for those values and stories. Losing sight of this, it seems to me, leaves us not only in history's ass pocket, but makes asses of us all. Today we find ourselves, and there's no reasonable way to deny this, in a moment of profound crisis. America is changing, and the substance of that transformation is clear. At least to me, it's clear. Americans are divided, and those divisions go well beyond ideological differences. They cut to the marrow of the bone. Too often we see each other as enemies. Disagreement is saturated with contempt. Mutuality drowns in the bitterness of our public discourse. The sense of common purpose and public good has been thrown into the trash bin as we huddle in our silos, and race shadows it all. Great replacement theory, public panic and terror around demographic shifts, assaults on voting rights, bitter debates about American history. We find ourselves living among men and women mad with the fever of a distorted view of liberty, willing to throw away this entire experiment in democracy as they cling to their fantasies. We are changing. But as James Baldwin put it, the horror, quote, is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all. Or we could use Amiri Baraka's phrase, the changing same. To be sure, there are a set of principles that define this republic. Principles articulated at the initial moment of its creation, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But those ideas have been contested, fought over, blood spilt in the name of them. There has been and remains something lurking in the shadows, something not so easily captured by phrases like our better angels or progress towards a more perfect union or faith in the founding principles. A closer look exposes the gap at the moment of creation between the stated ideals and the lived practices that unravel them, and the lies we tell ourselves about it all that split an emerging consciousness in two. In Shadow and Act, Ellison wrote this. He says, the principle of equality and freedom were splintered into warring entities, thus making for the unheralded emergence of a new principle or motive in the drama of American democracy. The motive or principle was race. It made for a split in America's moral identity that would infuse all of its acts with the quality of hypocrisy. Worse, it would fog the American's perception of himself, distort the national image, and blind him to the true nature of his cultural complexity, end quote. Whenever people move about, given what I do, I get paranoid. You all right? No, I'm just kidding. What do we make of the fact that we have been lying to ourselves since the beginning about who we are and what we've done? What do we make of that fact that a lie repeatedly told becomes a uniquely American form of madness that haunts the nation still? It seems to me, if we are sincere, and the question of sincerity is always a vexing issue in this country, we have to face the insidious workings of this lie, this particular written version of American history, if we are to imagine America anew. The time has come for us to examine ourselves for who we really are and in the full light of what we have done. And we must understand that who we really are is not some essentialist America. It has everything to do with the doings and sufferings that define, right, how we inhabit this space and time. We must do so without the crutch of our myths and legends about American exceptionalism, legends that protect our innocence, and that examination must involve an attempt, to use Baldwin's words, again, quote, to find out what is really happening here, end quote. The refusal to confront this reality has resulted in our not knowing who we really are, and what is fascinating, at least to me, is that in his address upon receiving the National Book Award in 1953, Ellison noted that, quote, the way home we seek is the condition of man's being at home in the world, which is called love, and which we term democracy. Our task, then, is always to challenge the apparent forms of reality, that is, the fixed manners and values of the few, and to struggle with it until it reveals its mad, very implicated chaos, its false faces, and until it surrenders its insight, its truth. Ellison would declare that America has yet to discover itself. It's lost in that kind of hierarchical psychosis that emerges at the moment of birth. He understood that we were not, in fact, at home in the world, that there was something quite loveless about this place. And what would that mean for his idea of democracy? That's the young Ellis, not the one that spoke here in 1979. But perhaps I'm yoking the old man too closely to that other figure who matters so much to me, and that is James Baldwin. In No Name in the Street, Baldwin put it this way: I've always been struck in America by an emotional poverty so bottomless and a terror of human life, of human touch so deep that virtually no American appears able to achieve any viable organic connection between his public stance and his private life. This is what makes them so baffling, he writes, so moving, so exacerbating, and so untrustworthy, end quote. He would later on describe, that white liberal power broker in the South with milky, wet eyes who grabs his crotch. These loveless people will inevitably, engage in a loveless touch. Baldwin declared in 1964, quote, "This is no place for love," end quote. But it is his formulation in a 1960 speech at Kalamazoo College that takes us to the heart of the matter, at least for me. Quote, "I want to suggest most seriously that before we can do very much in the way of clear thinking or clear doing as it relates to minorities in this country, we," Baldwin writes, "we must first crack the American image and find out and deal with what it hides. We cannot discuss the state of minorities until we first have some sense of what we are, who we are, what our goals are, and what we take life to be." Just as he did in Many Thousands Gone, here he occupies the mindset of that white generality. The we he's talking about is actually you. It is damn near impossible to get at these questions of who we are, what are our goals, and what do we take life to be, because madness congests the heart of this place. They, Baldwin wrote, quote, "do not really know what it is they are afraid of, but they know that they are afraid of something, and they are so frightened that they are nearly out of their minds," end quote. We have to confront the madness that sits at the heart of the polity. We must tap the source, the root. We have to toss aside the illusions and fantasies that protect our innocence, or less dramatically, we have to challenge directly that written version of American history. It is a central battleground. Baldwin wrote in 1964, "What is most terrible," quote, "is that American white men are not prepared to believe my version of the story, to believe that it happened. In order to avoid believing that, they have set up in themselves a fantastic system of evasions, denials, and justifications, which is about to destroy their grasp of reality, which is another way of saying their moral sense," end quote. He goes on to say, "What I'm trying to say is that the crime is not the most important thing here. What makes our situation serious is that we have spent so many generations pretending that it did not happen." So strange in its workings, you can even get Kamala Harris to mimic it. America's not racist. You remember that? Tim Scott can do it as well. And what I'm trying to suggest here, however clumsily, as I'm engaging with the old man and bringing him into conversation with Baldwin, what I'm trying to suggest, however clumsily, a Mississippi tongue, is that this is a form of madness. This is a form of madness. And of course, there's a counter to the madness. What Ellison writes about in Invisible Man, what's going on in the Golden Day with those black veterans, there's a counter to the madness, but it's a form of madness, right? What else is double consciousness but a form of madness? Think about August Wilson's Mad Men. Right? Sights of Truth, the chorus in his cycle of plays, yes? If we are to be otherwise. Y'all all right? I'm getting warmed up now. Here's my Cornell look. If we are to be otherwise, if we are to imagine a more just America, we have to tell ourselves a different version of what we've done and of who we are. Stories are critical to character formation, not only of the individual, but of the nation. Right, Melvin? The truth, or better, acceptance, is a difference. Acceptance becomes the basis for a different way of being together. Acceptance becomes the basis for a different way of being together. But it is hard to genuinely accept who we are in this country. We would rather be titillated by markets, affirmed through consumption, guided by image, moved about by what my colleague Imani Perry describes as, quote, the pornographic algorithms of desire and the simulacra that inundate us daily, end quote. The illusion of safety and comfort is found here, but in doing so, we remain permanently docked at the station doing the same damn things over and over again. Wash, rinse, and repeat. I'm reminded of Eugene O'Neill's Iceman Cometh in No Chance Saloon, just sitting at the damn bar, spouting one's dreams. And when forced to go outside, I can't taste my liquor. Just a few years before he delivered his talk here at Brown, Ellison found himself at another place, not too far from here. It's in Cambridge, as he addressed the Harvard class of 1949 on its 25th anniversary. Black power dominated the political scene. The crisis of Watergate raged. Richard Nixon would soon become the first president to resign his office. The country felt like it was coming apart at the seams. Ellison took the stage with a clear-eyed sense of the perils facing the nation, and he told the story of what happened in the summer of 1953 when he was last on Harvard's campus. He had stumbled upon the wall of Memorial Hall, engraved with the names of Harvard men killed in the Civil War. It was a moment, he said, of revelation, that these men had given their lives in part for his freedom, and that he had lived his life unaware of this indebtedness. Quote, standing there, I was ashamed of my ignorance, he said, and of the circumstances that had assigned these young men to the shadows of historical knowledge. The nation had turned its back on the sacrifices of these men and had repressed the details of the shameful abandonment of those goals, he wrote, for which they had given their lives. The betrayal of both the ideal of democracy and the memory of those who gave their lives for it, Ellison argued, haunted the country. It was a denial of the past, of history and its relevance to American life and its significance to any robust sense of American individuality and identity. He says, quote, a discontinuity had been imposed by the living and their heroic gestures had been repressed along with the details of the shameful abandonment of those goals for which they had given up their lives, end quote. All to maintain an American innocence in the face of, quote, the evil which sprung from good intentions, end quote. But for Ellison, innocence misnames the ethical blindness. Hubris is a better word, he argues. A tragic flaw in our national character and perception accompanied by arrogance and insolence. For him, the most damaging form of insolence and pride in the drama of American society was that of racism. It cripples our imaginations, deforms our moral sense, and distorts our characters. We have developed extensive rituals to evade it all, to put the ugliness of our past and present aside, rituals to forget. A forgetfulness that makes us vulnerable to the ghost of our national past and to the ugliness of our present. The struggles of the mid-20th century brought all of this to the fore, Ellison declared. The Civil War had not yet been settled. Lord, do we know that today? Those struggles, even in the face of the intense white backlash of the Nixon era, offered the nation an opportunity to face, quote, up to the reality of the Americanness of American diversity, end quote, and to the past which made us what we are, end quote. And here Ellison quotes T.S. Eliot, quote, "What we have inherited from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated," end quote, calling our attention to the bitterness at the bottom of the cup. We must not forget what has made us who we are. The old man seems to place the accents on different syllables just 6 years prior to his words in Sales Hall. A lot happened, I suppose, between 1974 and the dawn of the age of Reagan. But no matter. Ellison and Baldwin understood, no matter the difference in their temperaments, that the terrors and panic we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. We live in that gap, and it locks this country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. This is what June Jordan refers to as that nasty American habit of genteel make-believe, end quote. How shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? You see how dramatic I was? We must leave behind the sentimentality off, obviously. We don't want your crocodile tears. Sentimentality is the mask for cruelty, as Baldwin said. We must finally bury the view that desperately needs Black folk to be the sick men and women of our democracy. If we are to finally break loose from it all, we must, quote, "describe us to ourselves as we now are," to borrow a phrase from Henry James, "at the pitch of passion." And that will require that we crack open the American image and find out and deal with what it hides. And to do that, we will have to, as Baldwin wrote, tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. We will have to fight for that different version of American history, yet unwritten. Ellison held steadfast. Y'all all right? I'm going to check on you. I worried about the length of this. Is this okay? You got to be democratic. You can't be abusing people, especially when you like the sound of your own voice. Ellison held steadfast to his faith in America until his last breath, as pancreatic cancer ate him alive. Jimmy was heartbroken in his last days as the cancer stole his voice and his throat. He saw what the country had become, Jimmy did. In his last interview with Quincy Troop in November of 1987, just the following month he would be dead, he said, I was right. I was right about what was happening in the country, what was about to happen to all of us, really, one way or the other, and the choices people would have to make, and watching people make them and denying them at the same time. I don't care who says what. I watched it happen, and all of this because they want to be white, because it's the only way to justify the slaughter. End quote. Madness abounds still. Sounds familiar. I don't mean to suggest some clinical or medical notion of madness. I will leave that to those who want to keep their guns and say that the real problem rests with the mental health of the killers. We are not who we say we are in this country, and mirrors keep revealing the truth that makes paranoia a decided feature of our political lives, Richard Hofstadter notwithstanding. We suffer from a kind of national schizophrenia. Dr. King put it this way in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, quote, ever since the birth of our nation, white America has had a schizophrenic personality on the question of race. She has been torn between selves, a self in which she proudly professed the great principles of democracy, and a self in which she sadly practiced the antithesis of democracy. No one surveying the moral landscape of our nation can overlook the hideous wreckage of commitment twisted and turned to 1,000 shapes under the stress of such things. No matter how many mirrors we shatter or leave face down in the Rio Grande, we can't seem to escape the reality that drives us mad. Unwritten histories are not enough, old man. It's not enough, I keep shouting to the man who means so much to me. From Frederick Douglass to Du Bois to Harriet Jacobs to Toni Morrison, African-American writers, alongside many others, have tried to lay bare the meaning and implication of the written version of American history, the story as neatly stylized as ancient myth. And they spoke of the madness that results from it all, that the disorienting and disquieting gap between who we say we are as Americans and what we actually do casts a disturbing shadow over this place that feels heavy and wet like Mississippi summers in August. We are desperately afraid of being exposed, I think, particularly to ourselves, and that fear has led to a kind of delirium that erupts repeatedly, generationally, in unimaginable violence, and people keep asking us to hold on in the midst of it all. Again, this is more than a battle between our better and lesser angels. This is a fight we all experience. That is a fight we all experience, this battle between our better and lesser angels. That is perhaps a consequence of the debacle in the Garden of Eden. Original sin stains American madness but does not exhaust it. Ours is the effect of refusing at every turn and across generations to accept who we are. Ours the effect of refusing to accept who we are, to prefer illusion and fantasy over responsibility. The white well makes us all mad. In a 1993 interview with Charlie Rose, the late novelist Toni Morrison spoke of this madness. Rose asked Toni, quote, "Do you, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academia, etc., still have the encounter with racism?" End quote. Morrison looked disappointed in the question, perhaps more so disappointed in Rose, and as she pursed her lips and said with a smoke-laden softness, "Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you that that's the wrong question." And then Rose says, okay, what's the right question? And then she says this, "How do you feel?" Not you, Charlie Rose, but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's like a profound neuroses that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy, she said. It is crazy, she said. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people, and possibly equal, than it does on black people, end quote. Here, Morrison channels her reading of Herman Melville's classic novel, Moby Dick, its crazed character, Captain Ahab, and his obsession with the white whale. For her, the whale is, quote, more than blind and different nature. It represents perhaps the consolidation of whiteness as an ideology, as a way of seeing and being, of valuing certain bodies over others that swallows everything else whole. Quote, "If the white whale is the ideology of race," she writes in 1988, "what Ahab has lost to it is personal dismemberment and family and society and his own place as a human in the world. The trauma of racism is for the racist and for the victim the severe fragmentation of the self, and has always seemed to me a cause, not a symptom, of psychosis," end quote. I was about to make a reference to Jonah, but I changed my mind. Jonah and the whale. Anyway, always seems to me a cause, not a symptom of psychosis. This reality demands what Ellison labeled tricky or self-deceptive magic, what Baldwin called the price of the ticket. Whether we are referring to the errand in the wilderness of Puritans escaping European persecution, or to those who made their way to Ellis Island for something they thought was freedom, that journey required they leave something behind and narrow their understanding of themselves and of the world. They had to become white. They weaved stories to account for it all, and the costs were unimaginable. Quote, "This incredibly limited, not to say dim-witted ambition," Baldwin said, "has choked many a human being to death here. And I would add, it's driven a host of others mad." I was sitting in Union Station. I'm coming to a close. Believe me, I am. I was sitting in Union Station not too long ago, and something didn't feel quite right. I'll brag, I was going to see the vice president. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. I was sitting in Union Station, and something didn't feel quite right. Madness was angry. One young woman dressed in a tattered blue jogging suit, wearing slides with colorful mismatched socks. Her hair matted and locked randomly on one side of her head, screamed at this white man looking at the train station, at the train schedule. "There ain't no food in this damn trash." She commandeered the monitor, stood right in front of it. Everyone had to see her. She then stormed away shouting. She looked into another trash bin. "Shit, ain't nothing in here either," end quote. Another woman, weathered with loose skin hanging under her cropped shirt, argued with herself. "I talk to myself all the time. This ain't schizophrenia," she said. She rummaged through the trash, looking for food. A young black man quietly approached me in the midst of all of this, asked if I could help him get something to eat. He stands at a distance, scratching his head. I give him $20. I tell him to share. He says he will and leaves. About 10 minutes later, he returned, scratched his head, and said quietly, "Thank you." After taking it all in, I thought of Ellison's essay, Harlem is Nowhere, and his description of the madman hurling imaginary bombs in Harlem. I thought again of the madmen and women who serve as the chorus in August Wilson's cycle of plays, the characters out of time who seem to know the truth and bear witness where madness, right, reveals something about the cruelty and barbarity of reason itself. But what might it mean to make a radical and courageous choice now when madness abounds? What might it mean to fight for that unwritten version of history, to not find security in it, but to fight for a different story in the face of fever dreams that have spiked once again when it feels, as my daddy used to say, and still says, that white folk have lost their damn minds again. As he ended his remarks on that evening in September of 1979 in Sells Hall, the old man knew, I suspect, that something more was required. He said, quote, "Perhaps, if we learn more of what has happened and why it happened, we will learn more of who we really are. And perhaps if we learn more about our unwritten history, we won't be so vulnerable to the capriciousness of events as we are today." There it is again. Seems like an understatement in the face of Reagan's ascent. He knew what Reagan did in California. He knew what this all stood for. Perhaps Ellison, mad with his own unshakable faith, was engaged in a kind of tricky magic here. No matter. The safety and security of that unwritten history as the old man understood it, to my mind, is not enough. We have to tell ourselves a different story and fight for the values it commends if we are to be released from the madness into a new creation. Thank you so much. Yeah, go with it. Give me a moment.
Can you hear me? Oh, all right. You can hear me now? All right. So we have mics on either side. So you can feel free to sort of line up. And the floor is open to all of you to put some questions to Professor Glaude.
I tried not to leave too much time. No, I'm just kidding.
I think we're good for time, actually.
Hi.
I don't know why I'm always the one to break the ice. Hi, my name is Nancy Kalick. I teach here in Religious Studies and History. I had Langston in my classes. Please give him my regards. I have a question about the contemporary political discourse, which I used to think was anemic, but now I think is insidious.
It's insidious.
Insidious. And I ask that because in thinking about confronting the narrative as written, how upset people get when we do. And I'm thinking here about backlash to things like the 1619 Project, what's going on in Florida, and a really visceral reaction to the notion that America isn't what it tells itself it is. And what feels like madness to me is this tendency of what some are calling reactionary centrism. I'm thinking here of political analyst Aaron Huertas, but also Georgetown professor Thomas Zimmer, who have talked a lot about reactionary centrism, which it seems to me is normalizing the madness and making it, in fact, look like reason by saying that those who are too far left, this is the kind of anti-woke discourse, are inciting this kind of rightward trend. And so I wondered if you could offer us some of your thoughts on how to get past that dynamic, which I think is making it very difficult to even label this as madness because it's become not just normalized and ordinary, but almost praiseworthy for
Right.
being the more reasonable approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you too. That's wonderfully put. And I could reach for Baldwin and his skepticism of white liberals and his skepticism of American liberalism generally, or I could use a kind of, or I think I would prefer to use a kind of pithy formulation that the most dangerous combination to American progress is the combination of the loud racist and the white liberal who's afraid that we're going too far. And that combination arrests significant change every single time. And what we see over and over again, whether it was white women in the suburbs of Virginia who thought that Trumpism was a threat, but who then turned around and helped elect Youngkin because of the threat of CRT, right? How manufactured fear and grievance can be mobilized to sustain and support the status quo in very interesting sorts of ways. And so I think the challenge for us is not to locate those who greedily possess the narrative, to locate that greedy possession solely in the hands of the loud racist. It's like the nation displacing its sins onto the back of the South, where the South has to bear the burden of the nation's contradictions, when in fact it's the nation's, not that region alone. And oftentimes we think that it's only the Trumpist, right? Only the conservative Republican who holds the view of the country, this nation, the story, that is the problem, when in fact that's not the case. It saturates, it soaks the entire country, it seems to me. It often gets me in trouble as I inhabit the media space, because it seems as if when I'm talking to the quote unquote left-wing hosts, that I'm to the right of them. And when I'm talking to the right-wing hosts, that I'm to the left of them. And some people would interpret the position as a centrist position, when in fact, I think all of it needs to be troubled in some significant way. How do we do it? Well, we first begin with the assumption that the problem is not just simply that particular constituency, that the problem is us. So it's not only, say, white liberals, it's also a certain form of black liberalism that constrains and distorts, to my mind, and disfigures a certain kind of black politics, right? And we could talk about that some other time, but I think this is right on point. And Melvin, you're going to join in and help me.
Nah, I'm just up here to look good. That's all I'm here for. So,
Oh
that's
my
all I'm
God,
here
I see
for.
Steve. Hi, Steve. Hi. Oh, yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Glaude. Hi, Dr. Glaude. My name is Sam Theo Harris. There is a place, as you and Mr. Baldwin have made very clear, for despair and pessimism and hope at the same time in everything. How do we cultivate that hope without bordering on fantasy? How do we find a merited hope while staying grounded in a reality that merits despair?
Thank you so much for that question, Doc. I invoked Irish whiskey for a reason in the very beginning of the talk. There's this wonderful moment, and I write about this in Begin Again. Baldwin's in Istanbul, and he's being interviewed, I think it's 1970. He's being interviewed by a reporter from Ebony. And, you know, he has his Johnny Walker Black, he's holding forth, a cigarette in hand, I imagine. And the reporter asks him about hope. He gives them that gap-toothed grin, and he says to him, "Hope is invented every day." And when I read it the first time, it made me pause. And when I say it, and I've said it a lot over the years now, I still pause. Because in order to unpack it, if hope has to be invented every day, it means we have to beat back despair every day. They go hand in hand. I have to figure out how to get up out of the bed. And the best way I can respond to that, imagine slave quarters. Imagine a couple talking to each other under unimaginable conditions of brutality and cruelty. And in the midst of that conversation, one noticed a flit of love in the eye of the other. And that glimpse contains universes, multitudes. Imagine in that same cabin, suddenly you hear the sound of innocent laughter of children who are going to witness, maybe in a matter of minutes, unimaginable cruelty. But that glimpse, that glimmer of love and the sound of innocence breaks open space to imagine the otherwise. Or to use Charles Long's language, to see beyond the opacity of one's condition. Hope can sprout in the midst, right, of unimaginable darkness. A rose can evidence itself in the cracks of concrete, to paraphrase Tupac. Lord, I just quoted Tupac. I didn't quote him, I paraphrased it. But you see what I mean? So it's a blues-soaked hope. It's a hope that doesn't require, let me use Professor Rogers' language, it's a hope that doesn't require the guarantee of redemption. It's a hope that is clear about the possibility of failure. Nobody loves me but my mother, and she could be jiving too. B.B. King sang. You know, Cornell stole that from me.
It's always such a pleasure to see you,
Steve,
Professor
it's so
Glaude.
great to see you, man.
To learn from you, to see you, to hear your voice. Thank you so much. You're critical of the story America tells itself for its denial of the baked-in nature of white supremacy to the nation's history and present. And obviously, one of the things you're calling for is to re-narrate, to tell a different kind of story that acknowledges that and speaks that truth and confronts that truth. That's largely a critical re-narration, but I see hints of maybe a kind of re-narration that could while still fully acknowledging that, point towards possibilities. And I'm specifically thinking of your last sentence of your talk, where you speak of telling a kind of story and then living the values that that story embodies. And that left me wondering what might the contours of that story look like? And is it right to think that it might somehow point to a different kind of nation, even as it acknowledges the present and the past presence of white supremacy?
Absolutely, Stephen. It's such a delight to see you. Part of what would it mean to imagine a country in which everyone is accorded dignity and standing, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their gender, no matter their ability, no matter who they love, no matter their zip code, right? What would it mean to tell a story of the country that begins with an explicit acknowledgement of the contradictions, of the horrors that define who we are, those irrevocable deeds, as you write about, Melvin, in The Darkened Light of Faith. What does it mean to to tell a fuller story of our beginnings that then will lead us to assume that an affirmation of the dignity and standing of everyone, to believe that human beings aren't disposable, right? That cherishes, that offers a robust sense of the public good that follows from those first two. And part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that the story or the history that I'm calling for the point isn't about it being truer. The point that I'm trying to commend is it is a story that commends certain values to us about how we should live together. The fight isn't over simply a true story over and against a false one. It's that, of course, truth matters here, right? The facts matter here, as we talked about. But the values that the story captures, right, orient us to each other differently, which means, right, not only do we respect the right of women to control their bodies, right, but in the richest history of the nation, we're not okay with, people freezing in sub-zero weather because they have no home to live, right? Or police killing people, right? And taking photos of them as if they just killed an 8-point buck and they want to put his head on the side of the house, right? In the living room, So I'm hesitant to go constructive in that moment, but I'm willing to begin to talk about the values that I think are necessary for a genuinely democratic society to flourish, in which human dignity and standing is affirmed in our social political arrangements. It's a moral and ethical claim that I'm trying to make here, if that makes sense. Yes?
Yes, my name is Waleed Mohammed. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'm here I'm originally from Boston, which is known as somewhat as a racist city. And I had a racist experience, I might mention, being in a classroom. I believe it was middle school, I should say. Teacher told us black students that we should never even think about going to college because we'll never make it. You should think about doing something with your hands, work with your hands, but not college. But I happened to graduate from college, University of Rhode Island, in my later years. So I wish that teacher was around today.
I do too.
To witness that. Anyway, that's, as the saying goes, that's another story for another time. I do plan to recall my experiences in a book form at some point in time. But I want to thank you again for coming and sharing your remarks. It gives a lot food for thought, as the saying goes. When we hear certain things, we can always research. We just not to hear it, but to research and look into it. So That's what I intend to do, and I think this will be a good, give some good light to that.
Thank you, Doc.
But my question is, I'm sorry for taking up so much time. My question relates to the title, America is always changing, but America never changes. You mentioned that, no doubt, in your remarks, but could you just kind of talk about how that came about, that title?
Well, thank you so much for your question. It is a paraphrase of a formulation from Baldwin. And part of the way in which I render it, in a previous work, I talk about the value gap. And the value gap is my attempt to re-describe what organizes American life without using the category or phrase white supremacy, right? And to say that at the heart of all of these gaps, whether it's the education gap, whether it's the wealth gap, whether it's however we describe it, is a kind of valuation of human being, right? That some people are valued more than others. And that valuation affects the distribution of advantage and disadvantage and burden and benefit, right? And so what the value gap will look like under different material conditions, right, will change, will shift. So what the value gap looks like under the material conditions of slavery will be very different than what it would look like under the conditions, say, of Jim Crow. One is utter domination, the other is some modicum of freedom, or what it might look like under the conditions of the first Black president, or the first Black female vice president. But in each instance, even though the material conditions have changed, there's still a valuation of particular bodies in such a way that some people are valued more than others, which affects the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. So although it's changing, there is a changing same that runs through it. And this is my way of parsing what some people often think of as an ahistorical formulation that you hear in vernacular exchanges among Black folk. My great-grandmother, you know this place ain't gonna never change, right? Oh, you know white folks ain't gonna change. And some of y'all are going, they say that? Right? It's the great mystery about, but it is the great scandal of American life that Black folk don't run around loving white folk. It's the great scandal, right? And so part of how do we parse that, right? Obviously, my life isn't my daddy's life. I'm living hard at Princeton, right? But there's something that he's trying to note in saying that America has not changed, right? And that is this valuation that looks differently under different material conditions, but still has the effect, right, in the distribution of burden and benefit, right? So, police, I did this on Nicole Wallace yesterday. She was asking me about policing, and one of the guests had made the claim that it's easier for us to deal with the horrors of policing in this case because it was Black people, Black police officers, which allows us to bracket the race question. And I was like, no, because the dehumanization of the Black body is still the constant, right? And then I went, Harlem, 64, police. Watts, 65, police. Detroit, 67, police. Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, I could just go down the line. A form of policing, right, that presupposes, right, that certain bodies are subject to generalized disregard. And that's going to look differently under different conditions. That's not to say that, Harlem in 64 is the same as Harlem in 2023. That would be silly. But we can still talk about some continuity, right? You see the move? That's what I mean by the and I get it. This is Baldwin's formulation, but also you can see it in Miri Baraka's Changing Sane and other places as well. Is that Carlos? Hey, Carlos. I'm sorry. I've known him since he was a bit. Sorry. He's on the board of Brown too, aren't you? So I'm giving him a shout. So yeah. Wow. Oh my God, hey. It's like I'm at his home.
Do we have time for two more questions? Or?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. All right. So at least two, right?
We're good.
So welcome back to Brown. It's great to see you getting a lot of questions from your colleagues in religious studies this evening. So thank you. Part of your presentation this evening, you're really talking about kind of the nation changing, but also individuals changing, or the possibility of change, and aging and maturing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not, saying this about you in particular, but I remember a long time ago at the AAR, you brilliantly and graciously hosted this remarkable session on the place of religion in democracy. So it was Rorty, Stout, and Hauerwas. Yep. And a lot has happened since then. Some things haven't changed and some things have. So I was wondering if you could just take some time now to reflect on kind of your view today on the roles of religion in this democratic experiment in the US, especially in light of the madness that you so powerfully described.
Thank you so much, Mark. There was a gesture, and there were so many gestures in the talk. Some because I didn't have time, and others because I was trying to be witty and cute. There's a moment where I described the country as a God-soaked country, right? And part of what I was trying to do with that phrase was to kind of point to the way in which a certain white conservative evangelicalism is driving, right, the intensity of the experience of madness itself. That white Christian nationalism as a shorthand for that, right, not even a shorthand, as a description of that, isn't new, right? Douglas talks about the slave auction block being next to the church steeple. We understand that, the split, that the Civil War, that the split in American Christendom happened before one shell was shot at Fort Sumner, and it happened over the issue of race in very clear and distinct ways. And so what I'm witnessing in this moment, and Anthea Butler and others have been writing about it, is the kind of I guess this is Stanley's language and Cornell's appropriation of that language, how a certain kind of Constantinian Christianity is doing work in our current moment. And the need for a more pronounced prophetic Christian response, which we see in Reverend Bishop Barber's work and the like, the contestation on the ground. But part of what's happening, and David, the former president of the AAR, has made this, is that white conservative evangelicalism has transformed into kind of a white identity sect, right? And we saw it clearly over the 4 years with the Trump administration. And how do we break through that is by narrating, right, a different story within that context. Does that make sense? Right? I keep saying to people, my friends who are in that tradition, right, you need to claim God from the hands of these people. This is not my God. Bishop Barber, who I love, says, I am an evangelical, right? To try to offer the contrast, to offer the story. So the short answer, Mark, is that religion, Christianity, white Christianity in particular, is everywhere in the current madness. And it makes sense because it has always been present, right? As a way to absolve us of our sins, to afford us the holiday, the moral holiday in the face, right, of what we are doing and what we were doing, if that makes sense. It always comes in tow, right? Yeah, there's this image circulating of a man praying while another man is wielding a sword, right? That's in one church, another church. You've got guns, right? There's something happening here that's not unique. I mean, that's not unprecedented, but unique. Does that make sense? It's not unprecedented, but it's unique in its current convergence, if that makes sense. Yeah. Hi. Y'all are being so patient with me running my mouth. I appreciate you.
Hi, my name is Julie, and I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. You're an amazing speaker.
Thank you.
I was captivated. My question is, how do we move away from the social construct of race? Because that's what it is. We're all one, we're human, but prejudice and stereotypes being upheld by the media, how could we move away from that 3 generations from now, that we're together more than we're divided?
Yeah. Thank you. Mel and I were just talking something about this earlier. I said, we can choose our ancestors, but we can't dismiss our inheritances. I am what I am. That's me trying to be cute. Right? Race is a social construction, yes, but so is money. So it still has real effects. I don't want you to lose the particularity of who you are. Race doesn't exhaust the fullness of who I am. It offers a way of describing the brilliance, the beauty of the traditions out of which I come. Baldwin writes in Many Thousands Gone, as he assumes the voice of a white narrator. He's like, the condition for my entree is that I must wash my face blank so I can wash away your guilt. Is the precondition for me to enter Brown is that I have to leave the particularity of who I am at the door? Is the basis of our humanity being felt is that you have to be comfortable around me. In order for you to be comfortable around me, I have to quiet and mute myself? Oh, that's a contract I don't want to sign. Human beings, here I'm just talking with you now. Human beings, those are boring abstractions. We come in all colors with all different kinds of cultural resources and rhythms. And I want to bring the fullness of who I am. I want to bring my mama into the room. That doesn't mean I don't know which room, how to act in particular rooms. I keep telling people, when I'm traveling the country, bring your full self. And they're like, well, I can't. I said, well, you can't. What does that mean? What are you thinking? You bring your full self to church too, don't you? Or to mosque or synagogue. It's like, yeah, you don't act a fool in church or mosques, right? So what is this caricatured view of blackness you got going on? Bring your full self into the room and adjusting according to what the norms and guidance of the room. But you can bring the fullness of who you are. In the name of some unity, I don't want to leave behind my particularity. The price of that ticket has been paid. Period. What I want to do is to create the conditions under which you can be here at Brown and not have to deny the power of who you are. Those days are over. Period. And folk just gonna have to adjust. Bill Maher ain't doing it very well, but he's gonna have to adjust too. You feel me? So race is a social construction, yeah. Much of what we do, much of our language, it helps us move about, helps us identify practices that distribute harms, that exercise, right? The way in which the exercise of general disregard happens. We need race language to move about in this place, but it doesn't exhaust who we are, right? And that's the key. Just don't get trapped in the categories, but understand the utility of the categories, if that makes sense. Hi.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for your words, for the affirmations, for seeing this and, acknowledging. So I'd like to ask your response to what seems to be like a perceived challenge of freedoms in this awakening or this acknowledgement, in the acknowledgement of this unwritten history, the challenging of whiteness and white supremacy. So freedoms like the freedom to bear arms, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech. So to zoom in, this discourse has been presented in a lot of ways, but how should we interpret the movement to say welcome diversity of ideas and free speech in places like this?
I'm sorry, I'm kissing my teeth. That's not a civilized sound, according to some people. Free speech debate, diversity, viewpoint diversity, right? All of this is the kind of ironic appropriation of a particular discourse as the conservative right positions itself as victims, right? One of the ironies is that that there's a certain political orientation that wants to cordon off the 60s while absorbing and co-opting, right, its political forms in interesting sorts of ways by denying identity politics, but actually engaging in it, right, in all over and over and over and over again in interesting sorts of ways. So I tend to be very skeptical of those kinds of claims, right? But, I've been reading my Melvin Rogers, and there's a way in which we can think about freedom and its connection to dependency, right? That oftentimes we tend to think about freedoms in this kind of adolescent way, right? Freedom from constraint, right? Freedom from limitation, right? To do what I want to do, right? But what about freedom as entailing one's obligation to others, to freedom as evidenced in my relationship with others and the duties that follow therefrom, right? So I think it's really important for us to interrogate this. But I was writing this the other day in my new book. I was thinking about the raid on the Conestoga Village, right, in Pennsylvania before America was America, right? And so you have these people right at the edge before the French and Indian War, right? And there's suddenly the people in the backcountry Pennsylvania decide to attack this native community that had been friends, political friends, had been friends, as it were. And they engaged in wholesale slaughter. So much so that the community had to retreat to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Those men, right, the Paxton men, followed them to Lancaster and slaughtered men and women again. William Penn had to bring them to Philadelphia and use a British garrison to protect them. The men then thought that William Garrison was defending those who threatened their liberty. So they decide to march to Philadelphia. Sounds familiar. They wanted to march to Philadelphia to hand the petition to the governor because the governor had sided with these savages over and against these people, right? The real folk, right? Ben Franklin was dispatched. He writes about this in his autobiography, and it's horrible, horrible what he's saying. But here you see, before America was America, men mad with liberty, mad with the idea of freedom, used it to justify wholesale slaughter, right? Wholesale slaughter. So part of what we have to do in this regard is to understand the political motivation of its invocation, right? To resist falling into the trap of a certain liberal rendering of it, and then to offer our reconstructed meanings of what we think freedom ought to entail. That formulation was laden with a whole bunch of citations, but we'll make that later. Yes?
So very quickly, so we'll make this the last question, but I want you all to join us right outside for the reception. So yes.
Is there liquor at the reception?
I think there might be some wine.
Oh, okay. I shouldn't ask that? No, wait, am I acting up?
We have some stuff. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Samantha, and it's been a pleasure hearing you speak today, so thank you. I want to apologize. I have to read my question off my phone.
Sure.
So we talked today in a lot of political discussion about spotlighting the unwritten history ingrained in our country's racist past and present to appreciate a more realistic narrative and evoke genuine change. Yet it feels that in contemporary political and popular discussion, our nation and our leaders rely on two extremes to spotlight Black voices. Either we look at Black exceptionalism through people like academics or individuals who have mobilized despite systemic barriers, or we look at the mass sharing and distribution of trauma porn, from gruesome stories of slavery to people being in the streets by the police. How do we move beyond these expectations and extremities to create and generate a more holistic and representative discussion?
Ooh, Lord. Brown. Okay, Brown. I think we bring the fullness of who we are to the page. We render the extraordinary complexity of our journey, if I'm understanding the question. Right? Sometimes we want to reach for Black joy because we don't want to engage in the trauma porn. So we want to tell the story of Black joy. But see, if you just tell the story of joy, it's not the fullness of who we are. If you just tell the story of pain, it's not the fullness of who we are. If you tell the story of Black folk just simply as those fighting for justice, it's not the full story of who we are. Right? We are just as complicated as any human beings on the planet. We're going to die between urine and feces just like everybody else. Right? And so part of the way in which I would respond to that question is, how do we, in our accounts, oftentimes we're and this is Albert Murray and this is Ellison, that trajectory, there's a reduction of Black folk to sociological data. Right? We're the sick men and women of democracy, as Alain Locke put it. And so we get reduced to this kind of sociological data, which flattens out the complexity of our lives. And so in response or in reaction to that flattening, we then go to the opposite extreme. And this is what Ellison does, right? He goes to the unwritten text. If you don't look at what they're saying about us, but if you look at what we're doing, you'll see the vibrancy of Black life. So Ellison will nod to the horror, but then he wants to talk about this creative vernacular space where democracy is at work, because he doesn't want us reduced to that. But in making the move, he doesn't give enough attention to the violence that's being unleashed at the same time. So part of what pragmatism teaches me is that we have to find a third way. And that involves kind of rendering the full complexity of Black life. And that presumes, right, an assumption about, right, our humanity and all of its complexity, right? That seems only reasonable to me. I understand the political cash value of rendering us as all Willie Hortons. I understand the political cash value of rendering us all as Bigger Thomas. But we're neither just simply Willie Hortons or Bigger Thomas. Right? We're Zora Neale's. Right? We're Tony's. We're Lakeisha's. Right? We're Bebe's. We're Juanita's. Right? I can go down the line. And what does it mean to render that in all of its complexity? You see? You see, it's hard for us to get at that when people are dealing with symbol and stereotype instead of with human beings. Right? When stereotypes stand in for me, as opposed to you dealing with me, right? And part of what I try to do as a pundit is to break through it as much as I can. I remember Joe Scarborough saying this one time on television. He said, when I grew up in Mississippi, Eddie, I don't remember anybody using the N-word. Am I being naive? Yeah. Yeah, you know you heard it. Stop. How do we intervene? Not with a caricatured sense of what we take Blackness to be. I don't want to perform Blackness. I'm not from, the hood. I'm a country boy from Mississippi, raised Catholic, right? Went to Morehouse. I had to say that. I had to say it, right? I'm not talking about a caricatured vision of Blackness, right? What does it mean to bring the full complexity of who we are to the table? And let's begin there. That's the starting point. I don't know if that's an answer to your brilliant question, said with such a sonorous voice, but thank you for it. I appreciate y'all, and let's go get some cheese and wine.